Shalom, shalom, my Havarim, and greetings, my YouTube Mishpacha. What's up, my people? And welcome, friends, to Bible and a Bicycle SUPERCUTS. My name is Will, and I'm an aspirant follower of Yeshua HaMashiach. That is, Jesus Christ. What is the Bible and a Bicycle SUPERCUTS? SUPERCUTS is where we tackle a particular topic or subject within the pages of the Bible or surrounding the Bible. And first and foremost, we open up our Bibles, read it for ourselves, and read it in context where applicable. And then I go out so you don't have to, and I gather up the varying and oftentimes opposing opinions, ideologies, teachings, and preachings from various theologians, scholars, teachers, and preachers. And then I chop that all up through the magic of editing. We smush it all back together into something hopefully beneficial and cohesive. And then I serve it right up to you in the form of a SUPERCUTS fan edit. And in this here little video, we're taking a look at a very controversial subject, that being the subject of extraterrestrials within the pages of the Bible. What? ETs? Little green men? Flying saucers? In the Bible? Well, I assure you that this little video is going to be packed full of information. We're going to delve into everything from quantum physics to challenging the idea of Darwinian evolution. And to do that, we're going to rely upon the teachings of two esteemed gentlemen who unfortunately are no longer with us, but nonetheless have left behind some great teachings and preachings for us to glean from. First on the roster is that prolific preacher, Chuck Missler. And as a counterbalance, we have the teachings of the late, great Dr. Michael S. Heiser. So I urge you to get your Bibles handy so you can follow along, and I assure you that something to take notes with will be very handy during this excursion. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to these gentlemen as we explore the topic of extraterrestrials in the Bible. Alrighty.
A Christian perspective of UFOs. Now, one of the things that's going to come up is the nature of reality as we understand it from modern science, and to take advantage of a message that we're in possession of that we can prove and demonstrate that is clearly of extraterrestrial origin. So fasten your seatbelts. One of the things that the secular researchers have concluded about the UFOs, it doesn't take any insight to realize that the whole UFO area is full of hoaxes, nonsense, and foolishness. But when you strip away the hoaxes on the one hand, and when you strip away the deliberate disinformation by some very well-resourced groups on the other hand, what you have left is disturbingly real. There are occasions where these UFOs are confirmed. They're tracked on radar, leave radiation behind. They're tangible on the one hand. And on the other hand, they behave in ways that totally defy our perception of physical laws. There are many people that presume that they are from some other galaxy or in some outer space context. However, those of you that have done serious research in this area know that the most competent researchers in this area, people like J. Allen Hynek, who passed away a few years ago, and Jacques Vallée and others, have come to the conclusion they're not from some other galaxy, they're from another dimension within our own. And so one of the things we want to talk about, that's strange talk, and we can glibly use cliches without really understanding what they mean, drawn either from science, mathematics, or even the Bible, and use them rather glibly. We want to cut through that a little bit and lay some foundation. So I want to talk a little bit about hyperspaces.
Could there be extraterrestrial life? I think we need to go back and sort of give due credence to the theologians that have gone before us. In other words, there were very serious theologians, very serious Christians that had no problem with this proposition that there could be extraterrestrials. And they had good reasons for doing so. It didn't harm the biblical text for them. It didn't endorse a different theory of creation other than what the Bible had in its pages. It didn't harm the atonement. It didn't harm the image of God. And it wasn't equated with demons. How did they think through this issue and not fall prey to any of these fears?
Now, that's the kind of insight that led to Dr. Einstein's solutions as he grappled with the nature of our reality. Most of you know that in 1905, he had a special theory of relativity in which length, mass, and velocity and time are relative to the velocity of the observers, the famous initial step of this. And it was a few years later that he generalized this theory, and he discovered that there really is no distinction between time and space. If you're really properly briefed, you will always speak of space-time. We don't do that. We're comfortable with three spatial dimensions and time. We treat them separately. But we know in modern science that we live in at least a four-dimensional continuum. And by the way, this has been confirmed 12 different ways to 5 decimal places and beyond. In fact, I understand recently an experiment confirmed it to 14 decimal places. So the point is, while we call it the theory of relativity, it's far more than a theory, it's well confirmed. Now, this leads us then into the whole area of hyperspaces. You and I would tend to be most comfortable at visualizing this as 3 spatial dimensions, length, width, and height, and time. But time itself is a physical property. And in particle physics today, if you're current in reading particle physics, you know that they have concluded that we actually live in 10 dimensions. And it's interesting that that was perceived by the ancient Hebrew writers from Genesis chapter 1. But rather than do our homework in Genesis 1, we've spent billions of dollars on accelerators to determine it the hard way. But in any case, now the reason we're getting into this today is I think it's going to be useful for at least to consider the possibility that these UFOs, and more importantly, their occupants and whatever, are coming to us not from some far galaxy, although they seem to be posing as if they are, but they come from another dimension, and that has profound implications for you and I.
So in terms of myth number 1, it would go something like this. There would be people who would feel that if there was an extraterrestrial disclosure or event, that just sort of tanks the Bible. Why? Well, because the Bible doesn't mention extraterrestrials, and so there either can't be extraterrestrials or the Bible's wrong. Now that reasoning is, to be honest, completely incoherent. There are many things, so many things, that are real and that we know are real that aren't mentioned in the Bible. For instance, planets beyond Saturn. The Bible does mention Saturn in one place, but we know there are other planets beyond them. So does that make the Bible wrong because it didn't mention Pluto or Uranus? Well, of course not. How about places? China. The Bible doesn't talk about China, doesn't talk about Australia, doesn't talk about New Zealand, doesn't talk about North and South America. So if the Bible's silent on those things, that means the Bible's wrong. So why would we take that sort of thinking when it comes to extraterrestrials, the whole extraterrestrial question? Again, what I'm suggesting is we don't need to go there. We don't need to think this way, and frankly, we need to think better. We need to think coherently.
We have trouble going up in dimensions. If I start talking 4 or 5 dimensions, you and I will be at a loss because we're not specially trained in that way. But we can gain some insights by imagining something less than 3 and drawing some inferences. Let's imagine a world that has only 2 dimensions, like a plane. Let's imagine in our imagination that there are occupants with 2-dimensional occupants within that 2-dimensional plane. Now, if we came along as a 3-dimensional person and put our finger through that plane, what would the 2-dimensional people in that 2-dimensional world observe? A circle or a hole, yes, in a sense. Right, exactly. Let's take another example. If a 3-dimensional sphere is passing through that 2-dimensional universe, it will appear as a point that enlarges to a circle and then that reduces back to a point, because they would be perceiving a two-dimensional slice of that three-dimensional object passing through. Are we together? Now, let's assume we didn't have a circle, we had some other kind of an object, here represented such as a cube. If that cube tumbles through that space, not only will it start from a point and get big and then shrink, it will change shape as it goes through, and depending on how it's being cut by that plane. Are we together so far? There are many. Jacques Vallée, who's probably one of the most prominent published people in the UFO area, has suggested that these UFOs may be windows into another dimension more so than objects. And you and I have a tough time relating to that, but he may be very, very correct. Let's assume that we were trying to communicate a three-dimensional object to a two-dimensional world. We would be asking that two-dimensional world to encounter things that they don't encounter in their experience. Our imaginations are generally limited to our own experiences. One way we could try to do it if we had a cube would be to project that three-dimensional image into a two-dimensional space and maybe rotate it, but this behavior in the two-dimensional space would be bizarre to the two-dimensional occupants in any case. Now, another way we could do that would be to take a three-dimensional cube, say, and unravel it into two dimensions. And we would take that two-dimensional cube and start to unfold it and lay it out flat. And that would be a way, possibly, to try to get a two-dimensional being that we're communicating with to recognize what a three-dimensional cube might be. But all of these are very imperfect because we're asking that two-dimensional being in a two-dimensional world to extend their concepts into a dimension, up into a region that they have no experience with. Now let's take another example, and that is there are such things as hypercubes, a four-dimensional cube. How do I represent a hypercube in the three dimensions? One way is to unravel it, and one suggestion is what's called a Hinton cube, which is an unraveled Hinton cube or a hypercube called a tesseract. And even you and I look at that and have a tough time trying to relate to a four-dimensional cube. You say, well, what practical use? Interestingly enough, Salvador Dali used that tesseract, a four-dimensional cube, in his famous painting of the crucifixion.
Now, you could, in theory, actually go to at least two passages in the New Testament and justify the idea that there are other worlds. For instance, in Hebrews 1:2, the ESV has, God has spoken to us by his Son, through whom he created the world. But the Greek word behind world in that translation is actually plural. It's ionos. So you could translate the verse, through whom he, God, created the worlds. Again, through his Son, through Christ. Hebrews 11:3, you have the same word show up again. By faith, we understand that the universe, the ionos, which is plural, we could say, by faith, we understand that the worlds were created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are invisible. Now, I'm not suggesting this is how we should translate these verses. In Greek, you could have a plural noun that just sort of functions a different way other than to denote literal plurality. There are reasons why in that language a plural might show up, but you could actually translate these two verses to convey the idea that God has created other worlds. Now, that fact isn't something that would have escaped the early church. Again, in their discussion of other worlds, they knew about these things. But in our day, we seem to be totally unaware of them, and we seem to have been sucked in some cases, to this idea, again, a very incoherent idea, that if it isn't mentioned in the Bible, it can't be true. Again, that's a myth, and it's something we need to dispense with, not only for the question of could there be extraterrestrials, but also just generally in could there be all these other things as well.
Now, the irony of Einstein's life is he went to his death frustrated by not being able to relate gravity and light into that region. And it was actually in 1953 that Kaluza and Klein together developed by extending another dimension. Light is basically a vibration in 5 dimensions. Light and supergravity have been integrated by the Kaluza-Klein models, which are basically extending this four-dimensional space into more than four, 5, 6, and so forth. And in 1963, the Yang-Mills fields, extending it even further, have integrated electromagnetic and both the nuclear forces, both the strong and the weak nuclear forces, for those of you that are familiar with physics. There are four basic forces in the universe, and three of the four have been integrated by the techniques. Now, the current thinking from about 1984 on is that the universe actually consists of what the mathematicians called superstrings, and that they actually involve 10-dimensional mathematics. Now, it's not our purpose here to get into this area, because there's two kinds of people in the audience, those that are familiar with this and those that already have learned more than they really want to know about hyperspaces. But I want to mention this because there seems to be good evidence from the reports that these encounters that are going on involve hyperspaces. These UFOs and their occupants not only are clocked on radar and elsewhere at making right-angle turns at speeds that are incredible, which imply they're massless by our physics. They also go faster than the speed of sound without sonic booms, and that's a disturbing thing. But what's most disturbing is they seem to have the ability to materialize and dematerialize at will. And that disturbs us. It makes them seem what we would use the term supernatural. But that supernatural term may be derived only because of our limited understanding of nature.
The second myth to tackle would be something like this: that extraterrestrial life, if we knew it existed or had existed, would somehow prove random, undirected, godless, Darwinistic evolution. Now, I put it that way because there are some key terms there: random, undirected, and godless. Now, we know, again, those of us who do any reading in apologetics, the interface of science and Christianity, that many Christians, whether they be lay people or people in the hard sciences, don't have a problem with evolution. They would opt for something like theistic evolution. But what about those people who don't want to embrace evolution at all? Again, there are a lot of people in the church who would be very antagonistic to the idea of evolution from the get-go. They're the ones who are going to be more fearful of this or not. So on the one hand, we could dismiss this myth or this question by saying, hey, evolution's okay, God did it, this is the mechanism God used to put life here, and so on and so forth. And if there are extraterrestrials included in that, who cares? But let's try to approach it, again, for the person who really doesn't want to embrace evolution. I would say that this idea, again, this myth that the discovery of extraterrestrial life would prove godless evolution, is also incoherent. It would no more prove that idea than the idea of godless evolution proves our own existence. In other words, we still have a debate, and the debate isn't just within the religious community. The debate is within the scientific community. We still have a debate over whether evolution really is a comprehensive answer to human origins and the origin of life in general. So the myth itself doesn't really prove anything. Why couldn't an extraterrestrial, if it existed, have been specially created by God? How would we know that that wasn't the case? Why couldn't, we have some other view of the origin of that thing other than a godless evolutionary process? That's very logically where the scientific community, as it stands now, wants the discussion to go, and they want to use the pursuit of discovering extraterrestrial life to sort of prove that point. But my point is that that doesn't have to be the case. It doesn't have to be the way the whole idea is framed. A genuine extraterrestrial reality would in no way explain the beginning of life in its grandness. It wouldn't explain to us how we necessarily got here or what God did or didn't do. It just wouldn't do these things. Evolutionary theory can't necessarily explain these things now, even though we're talking about human life and life on this world. Frankly, again, a lot of this talk really is sort of ships passing in the night, where one idea gets married to another idea unnecessarily, and then sort of poisons the well for the whole discussion. Now, I'll grant that this whole discussion is easier if you are at least willing to consider theistic evolution. Again, how organic matter evolves and how it came to be in the first place have nothing to do with whether they're aliens or not. Again, that's a much larger and deeper question. But if you don't, again, there's no logical necessity to link these two ideas. You could have an extraterrestrial that got here, if your view is by special divine creation, God speaking it into existence. If you believe that for human life, why can't you believe that for extraterrestrial life? And there's no necessary connection between these ideas, and so one doesn't prove the other.
I want to cover something else because it's going to be very important for you and I as an opportunity to validate a message. And I want us to shed some baggage that we tend to carry with ourselves about this strange dimension called time. You and I tend to presume that time is linear and absolute. We assume that an hour yesterday is like an hour a year from now, and that there's really no discernible difference. We also think of time as linear. And when we were in school, the teacher would draw a line on the blackboard, and it would start, the left end would be the beginning of something, the birth of a person, the founding of a nation, or some such thing. And the right end of the line might be the death of that person or the termination of that empire, what have you. We've made timelines. How many of you have made timelines in school? Well, how many of you went to school? Okay, that's right. Well, because of this idea, when we encounter the concept of eternity, we jump to the model in our minds that eternity is sort of like a line that starts at infinity on the left and that goes to infinity on the right. That's a natural extrapolation from our own experience. Therefore, when we encounter something like God, we think of someone who has lots of time. And that turns out to be bad physics. Because God is not, time, we've learned from Einstein, is a physical property. And let's explore that a little bit, because that's important. We exist in more than 3 dimensions, and time itself is a physical property. Time, we know, varies with mass, acceleration, and gravity, just to name a few. And let me demonstrate that for you. If I had an atomic clock here on the platform and I raised it 1 meter, it would speed up by 1 part in 10 to the 16th. Not enough to adjust our personal schedules, obviously, but the point is predictable and measurable. Now, don't quarrel with the arithmetic. The point is that time is a physical property, and that has some profound implications for you and I. Albert Einstein summed it up very nicely. He said, people like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion.
The third myth that we should address is, would an ET reality really undermine the doctrines of the image of God and Christ's atonement? Now, you'll see this brought up a lot in the academic literature when it comes to the discussion of what an extraterrestrial reality would mean for mainstream religion. I would say that assumption, again, that an ET reality would undermine these ideas, is untrue in both cases. But let's take them in order. Let's talk about the image of God first. Now, to understand why ET doesn't undermine it or wouldn't, we have to understand what the image means. And understanding what it means requires understanding what it doesn't mean at first. Now, if you think biblically, if you go back to Genesis 1:26, which is sort of the reference point for the image of God, God creating human beings, male and female in his image, you read through the whole narrative. What you get are certain characteristics of the image. Whatever it is, men and women both possess it equally. You don't get it incrementally. In other words, you either have it or you don't. It's what makes humanity distinct from all other earthly creatures. It's somehow linked to God because it's his image. So has something to do with God. And it's also passed on generationally. We know that from Genesis 5, where Adam and Eve have a child, and the imaging language is used of their child, just like it was in Genesis 1. So we have these characteristics, and then that leads us to ask, well, what might the image be then? I'm going to ask it negatively. What fails those criteria? Again, the criteria of men and women have it. It's equally possessed. It's not incremental. It's what distinguishes us from everything else in earthly creation. And again, it can be passed on. It has something to do with God. What fails those criteria? Well, I would suggest these things fail. They are not the image. Consciousness, conscious life, sentience or self-awareness, intelligence, your emotions, the fact that human beings are said to have a soul or a spirit, conscience, a sense of morality, the ability to communicate, all of these things can't be the image according to those criteria. You say, well, Mike, that just doesn't sound right because, I've heard the image of God defined as one or all of those things. And I'm sure that you have. But they actually do fail in terms of the scriptural criteria that I just laid out.
We happen to have in our possession an extraterrestrial message that's been authenticated. And there are two critical discoveries that changed my life. My background is engineering, and I've spent most of a 30-year career as a high technology executive. The thing that impressed me most during my life is the discovery that the Bible, first of all, is an integrated message, even though it's written in 66 separate books by 40 different guys who didn't even know each other over a period of almost 2,000 years. It's an integrated message. I'm going to demonstrate that to you in a few moments. So the first point is that there's two discoveries, that it's an integrated message. The second thing we discover is that it has its origin from outside the dimensionality of time itself. And this is going to be very, very relevant because it describes the kinds of experiences that we see coming upon the planet Earth in some very unique ways. And so that's our goal today, to explore that a little bit.
Now, in the 20th century, there were a few other things that went on that today have really caused a lot of consternation, a lot of suspicion and fear among Christians when this subject comes up. In the 50s and the 60s, there's something that historians would call the contactee movement or the contactee phenomenon. And this is the era when you get lots of stories of people who claim to have seen not only things in the sky that they couldn't identify, again, UFOs, but also claiming to actually have been contacted by the occupants of those flying saucers, those UFOs, hence contactee movement. And what really sort of affected the way Christians thought about the whole UFO, the whole alien question in regard to the 50s and the 60s and the contactee movement was the messaging. The contactees, were supposedly told by extraterrestrials that, Jesus was one of them. Lots of Christian ideas were hijacked and sort of reformulated into space talk. Lots of New Age kind of thinking, at least that's the way we would term it today. And that really turned a lot of people off toward the idea of there being other worlds and extraterrestrial life. The alien abduction phenomenon that followed on the heels of the contactee phenomenon also did the same thing. People were actually physically harmed, or at least they alleged they had been harmed in these experiences where they were not only contacted by beings they thought were aliens, but the aliens would do all sorts of things to them. Some of them quite nasty, sexual violation, lots of things that in other contexts you would think are very overtly demonic, satanic even. This naturally led to Christians having a very low view of the whole question. Again, this whole phenomenon.
So God is not somebody who has lots of time. God is somebody who's outside the dimensionality of time altogether. And that's what Isaiah means when he says it, "Thus saith the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity." Now, if he has the technology to create us in the first place, does he have the technology to get a message to us? Of course. The problem is, how does he authenticate his message? How does he let us know that the message we possess is really from him and not some kind of contrivance or some kind of fraud? How many of you here in the audience believe that this is the Word of God? Wonderful. That's the politically correct response in this community. Outside, maybe not so, but here, okay. The question you need to ask yourself desperately is, how do you know? Because if we're correct, before this day's over, you're going to discover that we are being plunged into the greatest cosmic deception that will ever come upon the planet Earth.
Lastly, the whole ancient astronaut phenomena really deserves some attention here, because not only was the idea sort of popular that there were aliens and they had contacted some people and maybe abducted people and did awful things to them, but now, according to ancient astronaut theory, they had been here in antiquity and they'd raised up our great religious leaders, Muhammad and Jesus and Buddha. They were either taught by aliens or were the offspring of aliens or were aliens or something like that. Extraterrestrials had come here and built the pyramids. They'd given us Western civilization, even created humanity. All these narratives became, sort of part of the popular discourse in the 70s through books like Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Daniken or the works of Zecharia Sitchin. All of these things sort of run together. Contactee movement, alien abduction phenomenon, the ancient astronaut idea, to really making Christians predisposed to rejecting the whole question of whether there could be other worlds. Again, something in the Christian past that had been embraced. It was a consensus, and it was positive. Now, it didn't help that there were notable non-Christian authors and writers that actually agreed with the new Christian suspicion. People like Jacques Vallée, who became the model or the touch point for the French character, the French scientist in the movie Close Encounters, wrote a number of books, again, very negative toward these alleged alien phenomena. John Keel was another one. Operation Trojan Horse was his famous book. Again, these were not Christians, but they were very opposed, thought the whole alien question was deeply sinister, and they even used words like demonic for it. All of that sort of reinforced a very negative flavor in the church's mouth for this whole question of could there be other worlds.
God authenticates it by declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done. Only God has that capability, not angels, not any other created thing, only God himself. And he demonstrates that this is from him. How? By writing history before it happens. Now, we've talked a little bit about time. We've talked about multiple spaces, three-dimensional spaces, four-dimensional spaces. We've talked about that. Let's talk about time. You and I think of linear time. We have a tough time even thinking about two-dimensional or three-dimensional time. But let's imagine that this curve through three-dimensional space is a line that represents our timeline. Let's imagine some being is outside our dimensionality of time, and in our dimension of time, we have the past, the present, the future, as we experience it going through this line, right? Now, an analogy here would be like the parade that's going on right now through Roswell. If you're sitting on the curb watching these floats come around the corner, for you on that curb, that parade is a linear sequence of events. But if you are outside the plane of that parade, say in a helicopter above the parade, you can see the beginning at the end at the same instant. That's a clumsy analogy, but I think you get the idea. Now that means that even though for us it's past, present, and future, from someone in eternity who can watch the past, the present, and the future, it's in common, so to speak, for the one in eternity.
Now, for myself, I would say that it just doesn't have to be this way. We have, I think, to make a separation between the question of could there be other alien life forms out there and all of this other stuff, what people allege to, have been contacted by aliens or abducted by aliens. I think the better way to process those things is not alien life, but some kind of malevolent, sinister, demonic, spiritual phenomenon that's happening. In other words, they're not extraterrestrials. We have no proof that they're extraterrestrials, and it's sort of muddying the waters. It's sort of ruining what could be a good, interesting intellectual discussion that the church has had for centuries and even millennia. It's sort of poisoning that water because of the influence of spiritual, sinister forces that have become part of the narrative and that are actually being used or use themselves the whole question of other worlds to create sort of an acceptance of very anti-Christian and non-Christian thinking.
I'm going to suggest to you the great discovery in my life, and I hope it'll be in yours, is that that each book of the Bible is a key part of an integrated message. Every name, every number, every detail, even the numerical structure behind the text is there. It evidences skillful design. And as you discover that, you gain a whole different perspective and insight about what the Bible is really all about.
I'm also talking about alien abduction narratives. Again, whatever is happening to people or whatever they think is happening to them, again, is very sinister, very evil, very violent, and really, sort of undermines, any sort of confidence that the question of extraterrestrial life is something that Christians could be positive about. Because if these are aliens and the aliens are doing all this nasty stuff, we don't want any part of that. It's obviously demonic and satanic. Well, my thinking is those are two actually different and competing things. The question of whether there could be aliens, whether there could be extraterrestrials, is a lot different than asking the question, hey, these stories about contact and these stories about abduction, are those aliens or something else? They're actually two distinct arenas. In fact, if you actually talk to people who are not Christians, they could be atheists or anything else, but they're into UFO research, a lot of those people don't want anything to do with the contactee movement or the alien abduction movement. For the same reasons. They think it's ridiculous. They think that either people are imagining these things or inventing them. Some will say, well, maybe there are things like demons and this is what's happening here. But these are not aliens. These are not extraterrestrials. We should not mix these things up. But unfortunately, those things do get mixed.
When you study the Bible from Genesis to Revelation and take it seriously, you'll discover it all ties together. If you study the book of Revelation, you discover it's all in code, but every code is explained somewhere else in the Scripture, and when you go through it properly, it takes you into every book in the Bible, and you realize the whole thing is a pre-planned package. Even though 40 different guys penned it over thousands of years, and so on. So let's move on. Now, by the way, how does this all climax? Let's get back to this little model of our timeline. We're in that little linear time. And there's the throne in the throne room of the universe. On this timeline, there are the people of the past. I'll call them them. And there's us in the present. From the throne room of the universe, they could look down and see the dilemma, the predicament that they of the past got themselves into. And we are their offspring. So one came down to fulfill their requirements, to give them a destiny that was so fantastic they could not earn it for themselves. And we are the same beneficiaries of that. This is an example where someone traveled through time, entered our time, not to alter time, but to fulfill the future, our future. And how was this done? By a love letter, written in blood on a wooden cross that was erected in Judea some 2,000 years ago. A pivot point that the entire universe will be measured by. The conflicts that are going to be coming upon our earth have already been precast by this event. And we'll see this all unfold here as we go forward. Now, by the way, there's some other implications of this, just to keep you off balance. If that's heaven and this is time, and A is someone that died 1,000 years ago and went to heaven, no problem. B is somebody that died last week, that died and went to heaven. And C are people who are raptured, say, a week from Tuesday. They all could arrive at heaven at the same instant. So I just mentioned that. Some of you have theological problems about soul sleep and all these other heresies. There is another end run on that. And I'm not suggesting this is necessarily correct. I'm just trying to stretch your imagination relative to these dimensionalities we're talking about.
Now again, what I want to focus on and what I try to focus on is, on the one hand, if you're talking about alien abduction, again, whatever people think that is, whatever it might be, either real or imaginary, that's very obviously sinister. It's very obviously dark because of what happens to people and the way it affects them in their life. If we're talking about ancient astronauts, again, I think the proposition of ancient aliens being the explanation for things like the pyramids and the world's religions, I think it's patently absurd. As a text scholar, when it comes to the Bible especially, again, I can say it's absurd and an abuse of the biblical text. But those questions, as negative of a view as I have of them, for me, don't dictate how I think about the bigger question. Could there be extraterrestrials somewhere out there? Is there an inherent theological problem with that? In principle, no. And I want to explain why I think that way, why we have a lot of illegitimate fears when it comes to the bigger question. Could there be extraterrestrials out there somewhere? Would our faith be intact if there were? I think it would be intact, and we don't need to fear some of these connections that have been made to this issue. Demons, the whole question of it undermines, Jesus' atonement. It endorses evolution. Again, it harms the Bible in some way. These things are not legitimate fears. And so we need to sort of unpack why that's the case and how to think a little bit better as Christians about this issue, because, hey, somewhere down the road, we might actually find out that there is life elsewhere, and our faith doesn't need to crumble. It can be quite intact if that's the case.
What does this book tell us? It tells us, first of all, that we are in possession of a message of extraterrestrial origin. So it should not surprise us to find out that UFOs and such are in here, which is the primary subject of our gathering today. The book also portrays us as objects of an unseen warfare. Boy, we better find out what's going on and what the agenda is. Our eternal destiny depends upon our relationship with the winner of this cosmic conflict. And it's not new, but it's becoming increasingly visible. And I believe if our perspective is correct, it's going to come to its climax during our lifetime. Fasten your seatbelts. The question that you have to answer for yourselves before the day is over is, what is your readiness for this encounter?
Well, that was a cram session for the old cranium. Where do you land on this subject? Believe in UFOs and little green men coming to visit us from other planets out there? Or do you side on the side of it being some kind of interdimensional, unseen realm mixture there? I'd be very interested in what you have to say about it down in them comments down below. I myself lived down in Arizona during the early 2000s and had quite a few unusual encounters of my own. But there's a story for another video. As always, thank you. That's right, you watching this right now. Thank you for spending a little bit of your time here with me today. I know your time is valuable, and I really do appreciate you spending a little bit here with us. Hopefully opening up your Bibles, following along as we explore some of those more unusual topics contained within the pages of our Bibles. If you enjoyed this video or got anything from it whatsoever, you know the routine. If you're not already part of our little family here, when I hit that subscribe button down there so you don't miss the next video. And while you're down there, give us a little love with that thumbs up. And don't forget to hit that share button. Share it with your friends or family members that you think might enjoy watching this video or benefit in any way whatsoever. I hope to see you here next time. And until next time, remember, Yeshua, Jesus loves you. So do I. Get off of here. Go ride your bike. and read your Bible.